So the earliest accident that I could find actually was published in the Poughkeepsie Journal, April 7th, 1855. And it says, accident. The Newburgh Telegraph states that a man who is unknown, supposed to be a Welshman or a Welshman. So they didn't know who he was, but they knew that he might have been an immigrant or he had a Welsh accent, was killed near Washingtonville, Orange County on Friday of last week. He was on the track when the cars from the west were approaching, and in his endeavor to get out of the way, fell down an embankment wall of some 10 feet and struck his head on the frozen ground with sufficient force to fracture his skull and cause his death. This occurred 5 years after the Newburgh branch of the Erie Railroad was established. So again, it's a very early accident. You have, but it still pales in comparison to the Norwalk, Connecticut disaster, in which a train ran through an open drawbridge, killing 46 people, May 6, 1853, which was 2 years prior, and the Camp Hill, Pennsylvania train accident of July 17, 1856, when two trains collided, killing 66 people. Despite public outcry for reform and reintroduction of the 1871 resolution to investigate ways to reduce deaths on the railroads, corporations pushed back against any form of regulation. And legislation was left up to the states, whose patchwork quilt of rules and regulations made it hard for rail lines to coordinate with each other without conflict. Now, the first Safety Appliance Act of 1893 provided that every locomotive after January 1st of 1898 used in moving interstate traffic must have a power driving wheel and brake appliances for operating the train brake system, among many other safety features. There were other safety acts that followed, such as the Second Safety Appliance Act of 1903, the Third Safety Appliance Act of 1910, and the Supreme Court case of Iron Mountain and Southern Railway Company versus Taylor, which ruled that just being sufficient wasn't good enough. You actually had to prove that you were implementing safety protocols. But despite all of this, there were still issues. And of course, accidents do happen on the job, regardless of how many safety standards you put in place. There's always room for error. Case in point, I hate to say this, one of my favorite stories, really, that I've read in my time working here, mainly because of the heroism that also was involved with it. It was published in the Elmira Star Gazette, September 21st, 1914. The headline reads, engineer dies at post. Fortunately, fireman discovers dangerous fact in time to prevent wreck. On Wednesday, September 16th, engineer James O'Brien, who had complained a little recently of not being in the best of health, but there was no sign of this, boarded his train at Newburgh and made the run through Washingtonville to Greycourt, which is near Chester. On the return trip, the fireman Theodore Balmos, who was responsible for making sure the engine had enough fuel to maintain its speed, noticed that O'Brien didn't whistle as the train was passing a road crossing. Sensing something was wrong, the fireman noticed engineer O'Brien doubled up and unresponsive. The fireman immediately gained control of the train and brought the train to a halt after turning off the steam and applying the brakes as the train pulled into the Washingtonville depot. Now, the rest of this was actually published in the paper. Without knowledge of the grim tragedy which had been enacted in the cab of the engine which was drawing them, the passengers on a Newburgh branch train of the Erie rode into the Washingtonville station Wednesday night, each intent upon his or her own interests. It was not until their attention had been drawn to the unaccustomed delay and the scurrying about of the railroad men that they came to the realization of the peril through which they had passed, for only a moment before death had been at the throttle of their locomotive, and a faithful old engineer had passed away. Engineer O'Brien's body was returned to Port Jervis and was buried on Monday, September 21st. Fireman Balmos continued to serve in the Erie Railroad for many years, and he retired as an engineer in 1954. He served 50 years on the railroad. So imagine this guy too. He went from the age of steam all the way to diesel. And it kind of speaks to his knowledge of, even at that time, of what to do and his quick thinking skills that he was able to save those passengers on the train, unfortunately due to the untimely death of James O'Brien. Now, car accidents. Now, so again, this isn't a death, but it just kind of goes to show you how close things would come back then. As kind of Jill pointed out, this is an age before, we have seat belts, we don't have Crumples, the idea of a crumple zone. The earliest roads in our area were just, hunting paths. And even up until 1903, the roads were pretty much still gravel, or, not even, they were just dirt roads. So a postcard like this that we recently acquired as part of our collection kind of gives you a good idea of kind of what the roads were like back in the early days of cars. Now, the Middletown Times Press reported on October 16th, 1916, Washingtonville contractor hurt, Anadeo Ruggiero brought to hospital. Anadeo Ruggiero, a Washingtonville contractor, had a miraculous escape from death late Sunday afternoon when he lost control of his Ford touring car on the Middletown Goshen State Road near the John I. Bradley property. And the machine turned turtle, so it flipped over. From what a cute way of saying that you got into a rollover. Following the accident, Ruggiero's machine turned over twice before it came to a stop against a stone wall at the roadside. When the machine started on its plunge from the road, Ruggiero and a male companion, whose name was not learned, were both thrown out. The former sustaining cuts and bruises that required his being removed to Thrall Hospital in this city. He was on his way to his home in Washingtonville when the accident occurred. The passing autoist picked up the injured man and was rushed to the hospital where his injuries were dressed. He then left and went to his home. In the meantime, the wrecked Ford was taken to the post garage here, where repairs are being made today. So also tied into that article is the fact that there is no ambulance, right? There's no volunteer EMT service that's going to come pick him up. You're kind of trusting passing motorists to kind of say, oh, gee, there seems to be a problem here. And then being able to kind of put them in the back of their car and just drive them as fast as they can to the nearest place. That really is a near-death experience, as light as that story kind of seemed to make it. Now, in the home, this looks familiar, I'm sure, to a lot of you. It's a gas chandelier. As Jill pointed out, gas lights replaced a lot of the earlier lighting sources, such as beeswax, olive oil, fish oil, and whale oil. The chandeliers in our adult wing are a good example of gas lights. They were later converted to electric in the first quarter of the 20th century. But of course, as Jill pointed out, there seems to be some issues with gas, predominantly with the fact that if you don't turn it off and there's no source to burn off the gas, you could possibly die from asphyxiation. Case in point, the story from the Democrat and Chronicle published October 10th, 1901. Gas jet, his nemesis. Washingtonville farmer dies with woman in New York. New York, October 9th, James McElroy, a farmer of Washingtonville, and Mrs. Sadie Bowers, 24 years old, of the city, were found dead today in a furnished house in Brooklyn. Gas was escaping from the jet in the room when the woman who rents the house opened the door this morning. It is thought that the farmer turned off the gas upon retiring and turned it back on by mistake. Mrs. Bowers, who is separated from her husband, had lived at the furnished room house for some time past. McElroy arrived in Brooklyn only yesterday. He had come to attend the regular annual meeting of the Parkway Riding and Driving Club, for which he was a member. He was married and leaves a widow and several children. Now, that was how it was initially reported. Now, I shared this with Jill, and Jill pulled out a bunch of other articles, which I don't have time to read through, but it kind of tells, it's almost kind of like a game of telephone, where it's kind of like, here's the Associated Press posting of like, this is what happened, this is who was involved, this is when it happened. And then it kind of gets more and more embellished that he was this well-to-do farmer, he was a real gambler, there was a young boy that he kind of took under his stead who knew how much money he had in his pocket, and that was who kind of helped identify the bodies. So it's just, it kind of speaks to that kind of journalism of that time period where this is your entertainment source, and people would be reading this to you in some cases because you didn't know how to read yourself. And who's reporting it? You have the local papers who know this guy, and they're like, well, we're going to pump him up. And then you have the other papers that are like, well, this is what happened. This is terrible, but it's more suspicious that why did he die in this room with this woman? And that doesn't really, it's insinuated, but there's no real, tie-in there. Now, another big thing is stoves. Now, Jill also mentioned, again, there's a nice tie-in with this, with Jill's presentation as well. People being flammable, or at least the clothing that they were wearing was highly flammable in some cases. Yeah. So this is a typical stove of the time period that would have been used. And in this article that was published in the Port Jervis Tri-States Union says, girl badly burned. Now, this is how it was initially reported. It later gets reported that she dies. The tricky thing is, it's on the same page. So basically somebody kind of said, stop the presses. We need, found out that she just recently died. So we're going to post like an update basically there. So I'm going to read the first part, because the first part actually kind of does describe pretty much what happens. Lizzie Sheehan, and this is the sad part, aged 11 years old, is a patient in St. Luke's Hospital, Newburgh, where she is suffering great pain from external burns sustained at her home in Washingtonville on Monday. The lower part of her body is the worst burned. Mrs. Sheehan, the mother of Lizzie, went out of the house to a well nearby, leaving the child cutting some soap in a boiler on the stove. Her apron took fire from the ladder, and the flames at once enveloped her body. Before help could be effectual, she had been terribly seared and blistered. Dr. Reed was at once summoned and administered as much as he could to be her effort, hurrying her to the hospital in the evening, where she later died. So that's a very sad story. And again, you can imagine with she would be cutting she'd be probably standing on something, an ember from the bottom of the stove probably went out, lit her apron on fire, and that was that. And that was a very sad story to listen to read about. Now, I do want to tie in the library a little bit, and this is actually a cautionary tale, kind of speaking, personally to myself as a librarian here, because I'm going to be actually talking about a predecessor of mine who worked in the same building as the one I do now, doing the same exact job. Now, I got an email from a gentleman many years ago, a couple of months ago, asking me for some information on his family. It's the Belknap family. Now, he said, I have some information for you that might be of interest to you in your profession. So he gave me this obituary. It says Raymond Belknap. So it says Raymond Belknap was found in an unconscious condition on Thursday, sitting at his desk at Moffett Library, Washingtonville, of which he had been a librarian since that institution opened about 10 years ago. Mr. Belknap was taken at once to his home, where he died on Friday without having recovered consciousness. The deceased was a son of the late David Belknap and was born in Illinois 42 years ago. The family returned to Orange County and for some time lived on a farm near Washingtonville, removing to the village after David Belknap's death. Raymond Belknap, for a number of years, conducted a private school where young Cubans were taught the English language. So he's a pretty well-learned person. He had been a clerk in the village of Washingtonville for several years. One sister, Margaret, with whom the deceased made his home, survives. Apoplexy was the cause of death. And as Jill pointed out earlier, it's an antiquated word referring to a rupture in an internal organ and the accompanying symptoms. Medical professionals today use that term as, they usually use hemorrhage or stroke, specifying the location where the issue originated. And he is interred at Goodwill Presbyterian Cemetery in Montgomery, New York. Now, I'm using a photo of the library from around 1993 because this would have been the room roughly where Raymond Belknap would have been working, because that was one of the only rooms in the library that actually had any books in it, and that was where the librarian's desk usually was. So that's our local history room today. And again, if you think that this is just for this time period, there was a recent unfortunate death in a library in New Paltz, the Daleton Memorial Library. They lost, unfortunately, one of their longtime library staff members there, and he had passed away at his desk, and nobody knew that happened. So it's a very, for me, reading that was very chilling. And and I don't want to say that the library is haunted, but I always think about Raymond occasionally when I look over to the local history room where I'm having kind of like, I'm sitting at my desk in a quiet moment. I think about, this was the desk that he sat in, or roughly where he sat, and this is what he was doing. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending tonight. So any questions at all from the audience? Anybody? Yes.
Where was the train depot in Washingtonville?
Ah, that's a good question. It's on Depot Street, of course. If you go, it's right behind. And unfortunately it burnt down in the early 90s. There was an arson fire there, but it was, and the sad thing with that was that it was in the process of being landmarked when that happened. But it stood in our village for over almost 100 years before that happened. But it was right behind where the beer distributor is, where Newport Beverage is. Yeah, well, I wouldn't suggest going on it, but there is basically a rail bed there, and there are several trestles. Thank you. Yep. Again, would not recommend going on them. I did that once, nearly fell through, but you could still see them. That's evidence of the Erie branch there.
That old rail bed is going to be made part of the Heritage Trail. It's been recently purchased by the county, and I believe their time frame is sometime during 2023 that it will connect with the Heritage Trail at Great Court near Chester, and it will go as far as the Moon Viaduct, where there's access to Scunnamunk Trail. So that will become a walking trail, but right now it's not safe. There are several bridges that are dangerous to go across.
Thanks, Jim. And I'm just going to repeat for the people on Zoom that we're in there's a process of turning that into part of the Orange County Heritage Rail Trail from Great Court to Washingtonville. So that's really great news to hear. Very important part of our history. Any other questions from anybody here before we turn it over to Zoom? David is kind of just trying to get people to chime in if there's any questions there. No? Okay, so let me just check the chat really quick. Okay, looks like everybody is satisfied on Zoom, so thank you all for coming tonight, and have a safe drive home. And if you're interested in any upcoming local history talks, we do have flyers for upcoming programming here too.